What's going on, guys? Dan Watson, and I have the new Nikon Z6, and the bad news is that this is not the full review. The good news is that we have some really super exciting stuff going on this week with this camera. So if you don't see a link for the full review right up there, you're probably going to want to follow us on Instagram or something so you can see kind of behind the scenes of what we're doing. But back to the Z6, I mean, this is a camera I did want to show off because I have been able to shoot with it and get some experience with it. So while we're working on that full review, this will kind of help give you a little bit of guidance on whether or not you should be interested in this camera. And the quick one is, yes, you absolutely should be. It's a very incredible camera and a very good start for Nikon with their mirrorless cameras. And you don't have to wait for the full review. I actually have a link right down below where you can download the full resolution JPEG and RAW files that I have taken, including a low light test that I have shot so far. I will keep updating that folder, so be sure to check back because there'll be some new pictures that you can download and play around with yourself. Now, the images there as well are accompanied by another link to download basically my recommended gear for this camera. So if you want to check that out and see what kind of lenses, accessories, memory cards, because there's specific ones that you need to get for this, I recommend for that. You can check that out as well. So let's talk about the hardware, and if you've seen any of the Z7 stuff, you can pretty much watch all that because it's basically the identical camera, and that is a great thing. I mean, the build quality on this is exceptional. The grip feels fantastic. I do find my pinky is just barely on the edge of this thing, but it's still kind of secure on that one. Overall, the camera feels great in my hand. I don't find that I have any issues holding it. For a very compact body, which is what Nikon was going for, we have tons of option on here. Let's also talk about the customization on this. We do have far more customization than we would normally get on a sub $2,000 camera from Nikon, I would say. However, I will say this, a lot of the customization is going to be by accessing this dial right here. You hit that eye panel and you have full touchscreen access to any of these functions, and that part is great. It works exceptionally well. What is not okay is that some of the other buttons on this do not give you access to all of the functions of Nikon's camera, so they're very limited. We also do have two custom function buttons right here, and I kind of forget these exist, honestly, because I'm not used to having them there. I can pretty much reach them okay when I'm shooting photos. However, guess what? When I'm shooting video, I'm not holding my camera like this, and so I find that I basically have no custom functions for video other than using that eye function button and navigating off of the touch screen. So it would have been nice if we had some more customization for some of these buttons that I don't need, especially in video, to be able to access some really cool control functions that are limited to that on-screen menu. Now, in image quality, I'm not going to comment really right now. Again, you can download those full resolution RAW and JPEG files below. We're going to really put this camera through its paces before we test that. And again, we're going to be waiting for RAW support before we release the full video. I do want to show you a little bit with this, with the buffer and shooting, because this is kind of an interesting thing with this camera, is that we see specs claiming like 12 frames per second and stuff like that. In most cases, you will not get that. In order to do that, you have to lock aperture and you have to lock your ISO and you have to lock your focusing and all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to give you a preview on this and you can kind of see things for yourself. But here it is in full fast mode. Now, it depends on how you are shooting this. So for right now, I am going to shoot this on RAW only, which is how I would normally shoot. Right now, I'm actually shooting RAW plus JPEG because I don't have RAW capability, but that was how I would normally shoot. And I have 14-bit depth recording and the RAW compression on lossless compress, which is what I would normally shoot. It's not quite the fastest camera, and you can see how quickly I started filling up that buffer. Now, the good news is that buffer clears so incredibly quickly, so you can keep shooting right away, no problem. You have full access to the menu, and literally it's just those split seconds where the buffer starts to fill up and it's waiting for it to clear. So if you're shooting in any of the slower shooting modes, I find that it takes a long time to fill that buffer just because it's clearing about as fast as it shoots. So even though the buffer is not very deep and you can't hold a lot of images on it, it's clearing so fast that you just almost never fill it up. So you're probably looking at about 5 to 6 frames per second on this camera in actual real world use, and that is about it. Now the camera does have two options. One is called high for your fast shooting, and one is called high plus. Something that's very interesting is that high plus, the downside to that is it's not showing you a real-time view of what you're shooting. What it's instead doing is showing you your last image. I actually found that I liked it a lot because what you're not seeing is any shutter blackout at all. So you never see that shutter because all you're seeing is that last image that you took. I actually found I like it a lot, and I really enjoyed shooting that way, and I didn't have any issues at all seeing just my last frame when I'm shooting high frames per second. The only problem is that if you do fill your buffer, you're not going to be able to see anything except that last image, and you're not keeping shooting images. So that was the only time that I was probably a little bit better off with some of the lower speed modes or the regular high mode instead of that high plus. Otherwise, I was actually very fine with it. And the file sizes are going to be identical in that. Now your speeds are going to be determined by what your settings are, so as you change them, you will notice your camera getting faster. So if I change it to 12-bit RAW, you'll notice that my speeds got way faster. And so it's not an actual setting in there, it's you pick your preferred settings that you want to shoot, and then the camera will basically shoot as fast as it can with those settings in there. So that's an interesting thing with this camera. It's going to vary widely as far as your frame rates and your buffer filling up. I found it good, not exceptional. It's not going to replace your D850 or D5 anytime soon, but it was probably good enough to handle for most cases. 5.5 to 6 frames per second is reasonable, and that buffer cleared fast enough that I didn't find, even though it was a small buffer, I didn't find it very limiting. I have been able to test the image stabilization with this camera as well, and it does seem to be very good so far. I'm glad that we have it, especially because none of the new lenses that we have here, which we're going to talk about a little bit, are image stabilized, and so Nikon is able to give us 5-axis image stabilization with this, and it seems to work very well. Even for video, it's working pretty well. And also, even these lenses, your old Nikon lenses, are going to be stabilized, although it's 3-axis stabilization when you're using the adapter. So keep it in mind. Now, even the lenses that have stabilization are only 3-axis anyway, so you're not losing anything, but it will be 5-axis if you're using native lenses on this, and 3-axis if you're using the adapter. Another thing that Nikon has improved in this camera is the touchscreen functionality. It is much better. You can access pretty much all of the menu items in here. Having access to this function button is great. You're having one of the best touchscreen interfaces and experiences that I've had on any camera. So that is very good. Where it lacks is as soon as you put your eye to the viewfinder, that locks the screen completely. So you cannot move your focus points around. You can't select anything via the touch screen. Now you do have a joystick for moving your focus points around, which is great. I've seen some cameras leave this out, but it is great that even on this $2,000 camera, we still have that joystick functionality. However, the way that Nikon implements their autofocus system, it can be a little difficult to just use that joystick, and I do find myself wanting to adjust my focus points with the touchscreen. I love doing that on some other cameras, and it's kind of a shame that we don't have it here. I mean, when you're talking about having hundreds of autofocus points, it can take a little while to move your focus point from one end to the other, whereas when this is to your eye, you can just tap on that screen and select that place. And then also, the way that Nikon implements their general area touchscreen, where it's continuously checking the area for the thing you want to focus on, not being able to select your subject and just have it track that subject makes things very slow. The operation here in order to do that is several steps long, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I wish that they had implemented that. I actually find myself preferring to shoot live view like this because I can just tap the area that I want to focus on. The camera will track it if I want to track it. If I'm shooting a single point, I can move my single points around. So the touchscreen is great when it's active, and it's active in all of live view. I just don't like that when you put this up to your head and you look through the viewfinder, you don't have access to some of those controls. So let's talk lenses, because this is pretty big on this camera. We have a brand new lens mount. I don't find that Nikon is really showing off the capability of this lens mount with any of these lenses on here. Maybe we'll see that into next year. It looks like we'll have a 50mm 1.2 that might be a little bit more practical. I know they announced that, I think it was a 58mm 0.95 aperture lens, but I think that that one is really impractical. It's huge, it's manual focus only. It's not really showing off any capabilities of the camera. So hopefully we'll see that soon, but for right now, this is the spread that you get. We have a 24-70 f4, which is some advantage to this is you can actually bring it in like this and make it very compact and small, which I guess is why they made it a 24-70 instead of a 24-105. And then you put it out like this, and this is your range for your normal zoom. So it's pretty compact when you're not using it. That's nice and small. It's actually smaller than their prime lenses. They're the same size as those, which is nice. And then these are also 62mm on the filter thread for these two prime lenses and 72 for that. So keep that in mind. Kind of weird numbers on that, I would say. They are fully metal, so they feel great. The primes are a little bit large for a 1.8, I would say, but not too large. And they're fairly lightweight. And this is also a little bit heavier than the prime lenses, but still fairly lightweight and compact. So those are going to be your options there. Now, if you want to go with more lenses, which you probably will, this is the adapter you're going to have to use. I do not like this adapter at all because the tripod foot in here gets in the way anytime I want to use like a Manfrotto sliding plate or anything like that. So if you have a tripod plate that extends past the camera, then it means that you need to attach it to here. So what I find is that I'm always having, if I'm switching between native lenses and adapted lenses, I have an issue because I don't know where to mount my tripod. If I mount my tripod to here when I go to a native lens, I have to take it off and reattach it to the camera. It's annoying. I don't like this at all, especially for video shooting, but even for photo shooting, it's not my favorite because it really kind of gets in the way. I think they're hiding a motor in here for aperture control is what's going on, but either way, it's not my favorite method for that. It does work, and I found that the 24-70 f2.8 seems to focus very well. We have a new video coming up comparing this camera with the Canon EOS R and the Sony a7 R3, so make sure you're subscribed so you can see that as soon as it comes out. But yeah, it seemed to work very well. We used this 24-70 pretty much the whole time during that shoot, and focusing was great. So you do have access to their entire suite of lenses, basically. So I do find that these lenses complement the Z6, maybe a little bit more than the Z7. So that's good to see, and I do find that overall, I'm pretty pleased with my options. Probably my biggest question about this camera was how it was going to handle autofocus, and that was because this is really the first full-frame, awesome phase detection system that we've seen from Nikon. And so while we have several generations of this in other cameras, this is the first for Nikon, and for a first, it is very good. I wouldn't quite call it as good as their DSLRs or some other mirrorless cameras, probably not the best out there. I do think that their D850 is going to be better in many areas. So let's talk about some of those. So you do have a couple different autofocus modes. They are different than what you would find on a D850, like they're not called 3D tracking and things like that. You do have a very small pinpoint AF point. It is great to have that. Some other cameras, I think the Canon EOS R didn't have that mode, and it's great for getting that nice small autofocus point. Keep in mind that that point is contrast detection only, so it's going to be a little bit slower at autofocusing, and it can kind of go in and out a little bit. I wouldn't use it for moving subjects, but if you need to just focus on something very static and small, it can be good. We're missing things like eye autofocus, and so keeping track of a moving subject with that pinpoint autofocus, nailing their eye, is not ideal if the subject is moving, is the only thing. We do have single autofocus points. You can expand those areas to be a little bit larger. And then the largest point that we have is going to be an auto area, and that's Nikon's new way of calling their 3D tracking. I do find that this does not quite work as well, especially if you have your eye to the viewfinder, because again, if I want to activate that, I have to hit the OK button. I have to move my focus point around in order to get the subject into the box, or I can move the camera around until my subject is inside of a box, hit OK again. That selects my subject, and now that subject is being tracked. But if it ever loses it and I have to go back, I have to hit OK again, reselect my thing, and do it. It would be so much more convenient if we could just tap on the area, which you can do as long as you're holding the camera out like this. Then you have that option of just tapping on the area. The camera seems to do a great job sticking to it and tracking your subject, and it works really, really well. I did find that occasionally it switched off into the background and started to really hang on to that background and not focus back on the subject that I want. So once it loses it, it seemed to be really lost. But there is some settings in there that you can adjust how locked on it is and that kind of thing. So we'll play around with that a little bit more. But those are some general things that I've noticed so far with the autofocus system. It is good in most areas, but not phenomenally great. The other thing is going to be low light, and I don't find it absolutely amazing in low light. This camera is stopping down to, I believe, f5.6 in order to focus, and that is going to be a little bit more limiting. The good thing is no matter what lens you use, it's going to be about the same performance, but if you're using super wide aperture prime lens, there's no advantage to that. And so I think they rated their spec to like -1 EV, which is far behind what some other cameras are rated at, including like your D850, which I think is -4 EV for all points. So it is not the greatest in low light. It does have a low light mode that you can enable it, but it is very slow. I think it's contrast only detection on that one too, because it's very slow. You couldn't use it for tracking or moving subjects in there. So as the light starts to get dim, I do find that the performance of the autofocus system has just seemed to not keep up quite as well as I would have hoped. Video is also another area that Nikon has really stepped things up on. This is their best video camera by far that they have ever produced. You have 4K, 24 frames, 30 frames per second, no crop on that to enable a full pixel readout. You can enable a DX crop if you want to, which is great, similar to what Sony is doing on that. The only thing I will say is that the Nikon log profile is only available when going out to an external recorder, which I do think is a bad thing, because sometimes I'll be shooting some of my video hooked up to an external recorder, but I might pull off a couple shots without that external recorder, just recording internally, and there's no log option to kind of try and match that footage. There is a flat profile in here, which I did try as well, and it seems to work very well. By default, guys, this camera is set up with the sharpening turned up so high, it's almost unusable footage. So the first thing you need to do, turn down that sharpening a lot, and then I think you'll be a lot more satisfied with the video that we're getting from this camera. Video autofocus was also pretty good. I mean, it held on to me really well as I was moving around the frame. No matter what I was doing, it seemed to stick to me well. It's smooth. It wasn't jumpy or jittery like some other cameras. It was performing as I would expect. Again, there was a time that it held on to that background. It didn't want to re-lock back on me. So it does seem to be very sticky, including to the background. But other than that, I was pleasantly surprised, and I think autofocus on this is going to be very usable. So overall, I'd say I'm so far a pretty good fan of this camera. It's something I'm going to be using a lot, and it's something I'm really excited to be able to use a little bit more. There's a lot that Nikon got right, especially for a first iteration camera. I think they're offering compelling advantages to move from a DSLR into a mirrorless by getting a great quality EVF, the amazing touchscreen experience with autofocus that's actually pretty decent. It might not be the best on the market right now, but it is good enough to use in most cases. And we are getting a lot of advantages like in-body image stabilization and things like that that are making this a compelling option, especially for things like time lapses and videos and other things. This is probably one of the better cameras on the market today. Now, there are a couple things that, again, are going to take some testing before we figure out. Image quality we'll be judging a little bit soon. So stay tuned for that. Please subscribe and like this if this has been helpful for you at all. Look forward to that full review. If you've seen our full reviews, we do a pretty epic thing, and we try to shoot all kinds of awesome footage and take some really incredible pictures before we put that out. So that's why we're going to take a little bit more time and work on that. Also, check out the list of gear below, because, you know, things like the one card slot is going to be that XQD card, and I have some recommended choices for that. There aren't a whole lot of options there, so it's kind of Sony right now. But those are some options that you have there. So again, guys, thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for that next video, and I'll see you real soon.